The wind carried dust across the plains that morning, dry, biting, and full of warning. John Dutton stood on the front porch of his ranch house, coffee in hand, boots planted firm. From where he stood, he could see the ridge lines stretch across his land like a sleeping beast. It had been his family's land for 5 generations. And no one, not oil men, not bureaucrats, not time itself, had ever pushed him off it. That was about to change. A black and white cruiser rolled up the gravel drive, tires crunching like bone under pressure. The engine idled too long before shutting off. From the driver's side stepped a young man, lean, clean-shaven, his uniform crisp like it came straight from the bag. John didn't move. The officer adjusted his belt, glanced once at the mailbox, and began walking. "Mr. Dutton," he called. "You found me," John said without emotion. The officer held a folded piece of paper. He looked young enough to be John's grandson, and just proud enough to not know what that meant. "I'm Officer Bell, with the County Enforcement Unit." John sipped his coffee. "There's been an order. Regarding this property. I'm here to serve notice and begin the process." "What process would that be?" Bell cleared his throat. "Eviction, sir. By county ruling." A single bird cawed in the distance. John let the words settle in the air like dust. "You evict cattle from a fence, not people from their blood." "I'm just doing my job, sir." John stepped off the porch. His boots crunched the earth with the weight of generations. "You got paperwork?" Bell unfolded the notice. Held it out. "This was issued 2 days ago. Says here the land's in default due to—" "I know what it says." Bell stiffened. "Then you understand I have to act." "You don't have to do anything you'll regret." "I don't make the rules, sir." "No, but you enforce them. And that makes you responsible for where they go." The young man faltered, not out of fear, but because something in John's voice didn't match the lines he'd memorized. "I'll give you until the end of the day," Bell said. "After that, I'll have to escalate." John nodded. "Then you'd best call the sheriff." Bell squared his shoulders. "With all due respect, sir, I don't need permission to do my job." John reached up and adjusted his hat. The light caught the leather band. Worn, cracked, and embedded with a single tarnished brass concho, shaped like a Texas star. Bell stared at it for a second longer than he meant to. Something about it felt old, important, but he shook it off. He turned, walked back to the cruiser. John watched him go. An hour later, the sheriff's SUV rolled up the same drive. The dust hadn't even settled yet. The sheriff's SUV came to a slow halt behind the cruiser, its engine purring like a heavy animal. It didn't shut off immediately. That wasn't his way. Sheriff Eli Lawson believed in observation before action. He sat a moment, hands on the wheel, eyes fixed on the porch. John Dutton hadn't moved. Eli opened the door and stepped out slowly, his boots crunching the gravel in a rhythm older than the badge he wore. He was a thick man, built like a weathered oak, with eyes that had seen more than most folks cared to remember. He adjusted his belt, took off his hat, and started walking. Bell was halfway through a call when he noticed the sheriff approaching. "Yes, dispatch, I served notice, but the occupant is—" "Hang up," Eli said firmly. Bell blinked. "Sir." "I said hang up. I'm here now." Bell hesitated, then lowered the radio. Eli didn't look at the young officer again. His eyes were fixed on the man on the porch. "Morning, John." John tipped his hat. "Eli, you won't tell me what this is about?" John gestured to the folded paper still in his hand. "Seems your boy here thinks I'm trespassing on my own land." Eli looked at Bell. "That right?" "I served the notice according to procedure, Sheriff." "And who gave you the file?" "County office. Code enforcement." Eli nodded slowly. "And you didn't think to run it by me?" It was marked routine." "Nothing with this man's name on it is routine." Bell opened his mouth, but Eli held up a hand. "You see that hat he's wearing?" Bell glanced over. "Yes, sir." "You know what it means?" "No, sir." Eli looked at John. "You ever tell him?" John's voice was calm. "Didn't think he'd recognize the weight of it." Eli stepped closer. "That hat belonged to a man named Morgan Dutton. Wore it through 3 wars. One of them wasn't even ours. When he died, the governor came to the funeral. Half the county lined the road in silence. You know why?" Bell shook his head. "Because when Morgan spoke, people listened. And when his boy, John here, took the ranch, he made damn sure nothing about that legacy faded." Bell looked down, ashamed. John stepped forward. "I don't need tributes." I need the law to remember who it serves. Eli nodded. And I need young deputies to learn before they enforce. Bell cleared his throat. I didn't mean any disrespect. I just followed the process. Eli turned to him fully now. There's following the process, and there's understanding the land. You can't do this job right unless you know both. Bell looked at John. I'm sorry, sir. John didn't smile. Sorry doesn't fix much, but it's a start. Eli took the notice from Bell's hand and tore it cleanly in half. I'll handle this with the county. You can head back. Bell hesitated. Should I file a report? No, Eli said. You should read one. About the Battle of Ia Drang. Or maybe the Homestead Act. Then go home. Bell gave a short nod and walked back to his cruiser. He didn't start the engine right away. Eli turned back to John. You really want me to go to bat for this? John looked toward the ridge. You know what this land is. Eli followed his gaze. Yeah, I do. John didn't have to explain. The ridge had been part of a land dispute for years, not with individuals, but with corporations. The county was under pressure. Tax incentives. Deals made behind desks in rooms with no windows. They're coming at it sideways now, John said, through zoning and fees. Eli nodded. I'll stall it. Not forever. No. John took a long breath. Then we hold the line as long as we can. Eli smiled faintly. You always were a stubborn son of a bitch. That's why you like me. They shared a long silence. You still got that rifle in the barn? Eli asked. John smirked. You asking or worried? Both. I got it. Good. Eli looked down at the torn notice in his hand. You know this doesn't end here. I know. Then why keep fighting? John turned to him. Because if men like us stop, there's nothing left for the ones after. The sheriff nodded. I'll be in touch. John watched as he climbed into his SUV. As the vehicle pulled away, John turned back to the porch, finished his cold coffee, and looked toward the horizon. The wind picked up again. The next morning, the sun rose behind a veil of clouds, casting a silver light across the Dutton ranch. The fields were quiet, save for the soft clink of chains and the low shuffle of hooves. John had been up before dawn. Not out of habit, out of necessity. When land is threatened, you don't rest. You take inventory. Offenses of soil of soul. Inside the barn, John saddled an old quarter horse named Jasper. The horse had seen better days, but still had fire in him, the kind that mirrored John's own. He mounted up and rode along the southern fence line, where the borders blurred between ranchland and county jurisdiction, a line that meant everything to John and nothing to the people drawing maps in city halls. By 9 a.m., a black SUV was parked outside the gate. County Commissioner Blake Tarrow stepped out, flanked by a man in a navy suit and a woman with a clipboard. They didn't walk in. They waited. John took his time getting back to the house. He tied Jasper under the old cottonwood tree, adjusted his hat, and walked down the gravel path with the same slow, steady gait his father had taught him. Not rushed, not rattled, just grounded. Mr. Dutton, Tarrow called. We hoped you'd be home. John stopped a few feet from them. Most days I am. The man in the suit stepped forward. I'm Alan Price, counsel for the County Land Commission. This is Ms. Holloway, from Zoning and Development. John said nothing. Price cleared his throat. We're here to follow up on the enforcement notice issued yesterday. John's eyes didn't blink. The one your deputy tore in half. Tarrow interjected. John, come on now. We don't need to make this personal. It became personal when someone came to my land with a piece of paper and no history behind it. Holloway spoke for the first time. We understand the sensitivity, but the issue is legal. The land has been reassessed and flagged for commercial zoning. No one's owned this land but blood, John interrupted. My great-grandfathers, my fathers, mine, and someday my sons. Price shifted uncomfortably. There are public interests to consider. The county is expanding, and there are infrastructure needs. You can build a highway around me, John said, or over me, but you won't build it through me. Tarrow sighed. There's money behind this, John, federal and private. You're holding up a multi-million-dollar project. John stepped closer, so close that Price had to take a step back. You came out here thinking you'd talk me into submission, that I'd see logic in lines drawn by men who've never smelled the dirt they're claiming. But let me explain something to you. He looked each of them in the eye. This land is not for sale. It's not negotiable. It's not open to compromise. This land raised me, broke me, and built me again. I've buried men on this land. I've raised cattle and children here. And I won't hand it over for a check you wrote in a boardroom." They stood in silence. Even the wind had paused. Then Taro spoke. "Then you leave us no choice." John smirked. "There's always a choice. You just picked the wrong one." He turned and walked back toward the house. Price called after him. "You'll be served again, Mr. Dutton. This isn't over." John didn't turn around. It never is. That afternoon, word spread, as it always did in small towns. By sunset, 4 trucks were parked along the ridge. Men and women John had known for decades stood on the property line, not armed, not angry, just present. They brought chairs, coffee. One man brought an American flag and planted it in the dirt. By evening, the sheriff returned. "You expecting trouble?" Eli asked. John looked toward the ridge. "No, just showing where the line is." "You think it'll hold?" John nodded. "If it doesn't, we'll move it. Together." Eli smiled. "I'll park my cruiser at the gate tonight, just in case someone forgets what respect looks like." As night fell, the lights of the county faded behind the hills. But on the Dutton land, a fire was lit. Not for warmth, for memory. Sheriff Eli Lawson sat in his cruiser at the edge of the Dutton property, the dash lights dimmed to keep from drawing attention. The red glow of the radio dials gave the cabin a low pulse, like a slow heartbeat. Outside, wind combed through the fields, carrying the scent of cold grass and cattle. In the distance, campfire smoke curled upward from the ridge, where a quiet vigil continued. Ranchers, neighbors, and veterans gathered, not in protest, but in presence. None of them asked John for permission. They just came, because men like John didn't call for help. They simply stood, and others stood with them. John sat in the barn, sharpening an old blade. Not for use, for memory. The kind of work that kept hands busy when thoughts grew loud. Clarence Riley had once told him that legacy wasn't what you left behind, it was what you carried while you were still breathing. And tonight, John carried the weight of his name like armor. He heard footsteps on the gravel outside. Not rushed, not hostile, just hesitant. Roddy Bell stepped into the lamplight. John didn't look up. "Evening," the young officer said. "Bell." I heard what happened today." John kept working. "I wasn't sent," Bell added. "Just figured. I ought to be here." John stopped. "Set the blade down. You came to watch or to understand?" Roddy swallowed. "To understand." John nodded. "Then sit." They sat in silence for a while. Roddy watching John's hands, John watching the shadows flicker against the barn walls. "You ever lose something worth more than your job?" John asked. Roddy hesitated. "No, sir." "You will, if you're lucky." Roddy frowned. "Lucky? It means you had something worth protecting." Outside, a truck door slammed. More people arriving. Roddy looked toward the noise. "They're really here for you?" John shook his head. "They're here for what the land means. I just happen to be standing on it." Roddy was quiet a long time. Then he said, "What do you want to happen tomorrow?" John leaned back. "Nothing." Roddy waited. "I want them to forget we're here. To realize that pushing a man off his land doesn't build a future. It buries a past. And if they don't?" John stood. "Then we remind them what the past sounds like." At dawn, the horizon was quiet, until the low hum of engines approached. 4 government trucks, 2 sedans, 1 bulldozer on a flatbed. The line of neighbors held. Eli stepped out of his cruiser, stood in the road. The lead official approached. A different suit this time. Younger, smarter, less respectful. "We're here to proceed," the man said. "With what?" Eli asked. "Property clearance." Eli shook his head. "Not without a court order. We have administrative backing." Eli glanced toward John, who was already walking down the hill. John stopped a few feet from the convoy. "You bring your papers." "We don't need your permission." "Then you'd better bring your conscience. Because everything after this moment, it's on you." The man laughed nervously. "You threatening a federal action, Mr. Dutton?" John didn't answer. The man looked past him, at the veterans, the ranchers, the flags. Then he looked at Eli. "You going to stop us?" Eli rested his hand on his belt. "I'm going to document everything." The man hesitated, then turned. "We'll come back." John replied, "So will we." The trucks turned around. The line held. 3 days passed. The officials didn't return. Not yet. But the pressure was building, not just on the county, but on John Dutton. Reporters began circling like vultures over roadkill. A story had taken root, and the narrative was drifting out of his hands. John didn't speak to them. Not once. He gave them silence. And silence in the right hands is louder than anger. Roddy returned each morning, parking outside the gate, no longer in uniform. He brought coffee, sometimes firewood, once even a pie from his mother. He sat with Clarence, helped fix a broken hinge on the south fence, and listened. Sheriff Eli kept the county at bay, filing temporary injunctions and citing procedural delays. But even he knew the time bought was short. On the 4th night, as frost began to lace the edges of the grass, a black sedan rolled down the dirt road. Not fast, not cautious, just certain. John met it halfway. The door opened, and an older man stepped out. He wore a coat that hadn't seen daylight in years, and shoes better suited to carpet than dirt. But his face held weight, not just years, but knowledge and regret. "Mr. Dutton," the man said. "I'm Albert Greaves. You may not remember me." "I remember," John replied. "You were my father's lawyer. Once." Greaves nodded. "I was also the one who negotiated the zoning deal with the county. The first one. 23 years ago." John didn't move. "I came because I owe a debt," Greaves said. John narrowed his eyes. "Your father saved my boy from drowning," the old man continued. "Pulled him out of the Yellowstone barehanded, when the current was too strong for anyone else to try." John nodded once. "He never told me that." He wouldn't. There was a silence between them, older than both. "I can delay the vote. Maybe longer. But not forever," Greaves said. "Then by me time," John replied. "Some debts don't get paid with words." Greaves looked around at the campfires, the flags, the men and women who had stood their ground. "You've got more power here than they do in the Capitol. Only if we hold it with quiet hands." Greaves returned to his car and drove away. The next morning, a letter arrived, signed and sealed by the county commission. The zoning case was suspended pending review. No charges, no trespass enforcement, no bulldozers, just one line at the bottom. "Respectfully, Albert Greaves." John handed the letter to Eli, who read it twice. "You did it," the sheriff said. John shook his head. "We bought time. That's all." Clarence patted Roddy on the back. "Sometimes that's the whole war." Roddy looked to John. "What happens now?" John didn't answer. He looked toward the horizon. "You keep the line, even when no one's watching." A week passed without noise. No officials, no papers, no threats. Just sunrise work and the soft quiet that settled over the Dutton ranch like a blessing. But no one relaxed. John kept his days steady, feeding horses, checking the fence line, sitting with Clarence by the old fire barrel. Eli stopped by every morning. Never long. Just enough to be seen. Enough to remind the town whose side he stood on. Roddy had started carrying a notebook. He never wrote much in it while on the ranch, but he was always holding it. John noticed, but never asked. One morning, as frost clung to the windows and Jasper's breath rose in clouds, John stepped into the barn to find Roddy waiting, notebook open. "Something on your mind?" John asked. Roddy held up the page. On it a single line. "Don't wear the badge until you understand the weight of a name." John read it, then looked up. "That yours?" Roddy shook his head. "Yours. I just listened." John nodded. "Keep listening." That afternoon, word came quietly. The case was closed. Permanently. The commission had pulled the application. Greaves had resigned, citing health reasons. The land was safe. For now. But John didn't celebrate. Neither did anyone else. Because this wasn't victory. This was survival. That evening, they built a new fence post along the ridge. Not because it was needed, but because the act meant something. Eli drove the first stake. Roddy hammered the second. Clarence carved initials into the third. J.D. Later, as the sun dipped low and the sky blazed with color, John stood at the top of the hill, watching the town below. Lights flickered on, houses settling in for the night. Roddy joined him. "You think it's over?" the young man asked. John didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Nothing like this is ever over. It just waits. In silence. In the cracks. And if we stop watching, it comes back wearing a new face." Roddy nodded. "Then we keep watching." They stood side by side for a while. "Do me a favor," John said finally. "Anything." When they ask you someday about this land, about this fight, don't tell them my name first. Roddy looked puzzled. Why not? Because this wasn't about me. It was about everyone who stood here. Everyone who chose to mean something. Start with that. Roddy looked out across the fields. And if they ask about you? John tipped his hat low. Just say I wore the name right. As night fell, the barn lights glowed golden. Laughter drifted up from the camp. Clarence told an old joke about a mule and a preacher. Eli poured coffee. Roddy wrote a few more words in his notebook. The fire crackled. The wind held its breath. And the name Dutton rested quietly in the soil, where it had always belonged. If this story moved you, leave a like and subscribe. Every view, every share helps keep alive the kind of storytelling that still believes in honor, land, and legacy. Help us carry the weight of names like John Dutton, stories that remind the world what it means to stand your ground. Thank you for being here.